What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast, Breathwork. We've heard about it. It's become increasingly popular over the past few years, rightfully so. Most of us don't breathe correctly. So I brought in a subject matter expert, not just on breathing, but functional medicine in general, Dr. Sachin Patel. I first met him in 2016 at a Mindshare event, and we've kept in touch online, and we have many colleagues in common, many mutual colleagues. So, welcome to the show, Dr. Patel.
Thank you. Thank you. What an honor and what an exciting subject matter to discuss. Nothing more important than breathing. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Absolutely. I think it's great, breath work because the gadgets are cool. Like we were just discussing one before we started recording. Supplements are necessary in today's world to a degree. But breath work is something that, it's free. Like you have to invest time, but, financially it's free. So a lot of times I've seen patients and clients, they just kind of automatically dismiss it because, oh, it doesn't cost money. I don't have to invest financially. So it can't have any positive impact on my quality of life. But talk to us, first of all, why do we breathe and why has our breathing become so dysregulated?
Yeah, great question. So the breath, our kind of unconscious breath is a reflection of the state of our nervous system. So as our nervous systems become more dysregulated, which I think that's at an all-time high right now, our baseline breath, our unconscious breath, correspondingly also becomes dysregulated. And that's one of the places that we can see it in somebody's visual and physical presentation. When it comes to breathing, why we breathe, there's actually a few reasons why we breathe. The classic response that most people think is probably for us to get oxygen into our bodies. And that's absolutely true. We need to breathe and respire to get oxygen into our cells, and specifically in our mitochondria, where that's the only place we use oxygen is in our mitochondria. The other reason we breathe is to get rid of carbon dioxide, which is an important signaling molecule. And carbon dioxide is a waste product of mitochondrial respiration. So the two waste products of mitochondrial function is water and CO2. And so, of course, we get rid of the water through our sweat, through our breath as well, because there's moisture in our breath, and through our urine. And then the carbon dioxide we get rid of through our breath. But there's a few other reasons why we breathe that are often overlooked. And these are reasons that I didn't know about and never really thought about, but they'll make perfect sense. So our diaphragm, which is a muscle that sits just below our lungs, is also referred to as our second heart. And so as the diaphragm moves up and down, it actually mechanically assists the heart in pumping blood. As our lungs inflate and deflate with every breath we take, that also assists the heart in mechanically pumping blood. Some of the biggest lymph nodes in our body are underneath our diaphragm. So when we breathe, especially when we breathe correctly, our diaphragm is also pumping lymph, which is the waste products that are produced from cellular metabolism. We produce about 12 liters of lymph every day. We only have about 5 liters of blood in our body. And, the lymph has to be removed or moved throughout the body and then filtered, and then the waste products removed. Another reason we breathe is to drive the hydraulic pump that makes up our myofascial system. And so, our lymph requires proper breathing, our respiratory and cardiovascular system requires proper breathing, and our myofascial system requires proper breathing. And so these are things that are necessary in order for us to survive. And then our breath can actually be overridden. So we have an unconscious breath, which is how most people breathe throughout the day. And then we have a conscious breath. So we can actually take our diaphragm and manipulate it and mobilize it in such a way that helps us control the depth of our breath, the rate of our breath. And then, of course, we can control through our face, whether we breathe through our mouth or whether we breathe through our nose, which nostril we breathe through, and the pace at which we breathe through as well. So we can actually truly steer our nervous system in the direction we want to go in once we learn proper breathing mechanics. And another interesting fun fact about the diaphragm is that it's the only conscious muscle that we can control that is active 24/7. So every other muscle shuts off when we go to bed, except our heart and our diaphragm. Our heart, we can't consciously control. However, we can control our heart rate indirectly by controlling our respiratory rate, the depth of our breath, and the pace of our breath. So those are some of the reasons why we breathe. I mean, it's quite profound when you think about it. And then there's one more reason, and that is to regulate our emotions. So you can actually regulate your emotional state and choose your emotional state by choosing the way you breathe. So, for example, I call these breathing signatures. When we laugh, that's a breathing signature. When we cry and sob, that's a breathing signature. When somebody's having an orgasm, that's a breathing signature. When somebody is going for a run, that runner's breath, that breath that they're experiencing, that runner's high is actually coming from their breath. So how we breathe also can be manipulated and utilized to control our emotional state. And this is happening at an unconscious level. So, for example, when we hear something funny, we laugh, and that actually creates a change in our body's chemistry that can be measured and quantified and visualized. However, it's important to know that it's a two-way street. So I can have somebody, I don't have to have somebody run to have them experience a runner's high. I can show them how to breathe in their seat and they can experience that runner's high. If somebody is laughing, right, I can force them to laugh or breathe the way they would if they were laughing. And within a few minutes, their body's chemistry will start to change. So how we breathe also not only has a physical effect on our body and not only has a physiological effect on our body, but also has an emotional effect on our body.
Very well said and very thorough answer. I'm glad you brought up the topic of lymph and lymph stagnation. Our heart pumps blood throughout the body, but our lymphatic system requires muscular contractions. So, even if I'm going to the gym 5 days a week for an hour, I still use my vibration plate 10 to 20 minutes a day. That, doesn't replace all the movement, but it gets things moving along with dry brushing. But now I have another reason to focus on my breath and breath work to get my lymphatic system moving. And this is really important if you're watching or listening, you're dealing with stealth pathogens, mold toxicity, actually any kind of toxicity. The garbage disposal system. If the garbage disposal is clogged, you're not going to go dump more trash on top of it. And a lot of people I see, their drainage pathways are congested and they're just going in and killing and nuking everything. And it makes them worse and they chalk it up to a Herxheimer reaction. And sometimes that's true, but oftentimes it's stagnation of the lymph. So the lymphatic system, what are some other ways that we can get the lymphatic system moving?
Yeah, great question. So obviously movement, as you mentioned, we actually have three hearts in Chinese medicine. So the first heart is obviously the heart that we have, the one that we think of in our chest. Our diaphragm is referred to as the second heart, and our soleus muscles, which are our calf muscles, those are referred to as the third heart. So movement is one of our primary ways of moving lymph. Dry brushing is another way. Certain body positions. So there's if you lay on your back and just put your legs up, that's also going to help with drainage and moving things along. And then, of course, proper breathing is going to help. And even massages, like you can get lymphatic massages, can also be very helpful in moving lymph in the body as well. Those are just a few that are pretty easy for people to start incorporating and really don't cost much for them to do either.
Absolutely. So let's talk about what optimal breathing should look like because, obviously the food we eat is important, our light environment's important. But if we're breathing 12 to 16 times a minute, times 60 minutes in an hour, times 24 hours in a day, suddenly you realize, okay, the air quality might be more important than food, right?
But we consume 30 pounds of air a day. So when you think about it, we consume more air than anything else that goes into our body. And, prana, which is the life force or key in Chinese medicine, that's air, right? So we can only go just a few minutes without breathing. And we can go days without months, in some cases, without eating anything, depending on somebody's body composition. We can go days without drinking any water, maybe a day or two without sleeping. However, we can't go more than just a few minutes without breathing. So I would argue that breathing is one of the most important things that we do. And it's one of those things that we've been doing our entire lives, but nobody's really been paying attention to how we breathe. They pay attention to whether we're breathing when we're born. And when we're taking our last breath, that's when people are really zoomed in to pay attention. However, every moment in between there isn't very much attention that's paid to it. And so what I'm trying to do, and thankfully with conversations like this, is bring people's awareness to how they breathe. And your question is, what is the right way to breathe? Well, the right way to breathe is going to depend on what you're actually doing. So if I'm going for a run, there's a way to breathe. If I'm checking email, there's a way to breathe. If I'm trying to go to sleep, there's a way to breathe. So there's different breathing cadences and ways that we can breathe in order to match our environment. So just like your nervous system is constantly trying to match the environment that you're in. So if you're in a stressful environment, your nervous system is going to be reflective of that. However, it's important to note that at an unconscious level, your breath is also going to be reflective of the state of your nervous system as well. So the correct way to breathe, I would say 99% of the time, is something called coherence breathing. And coherence breathing has been shown to increase the connection between the heart and the brain. And I would say that the world needs more hearts and brains connected right now so we can make heart-centered and wiser decisions. And the way coherence breathing works, it's really simple. It's by placing our tongue at the roof of our mouth. Just behind our front two teeth, you'll feel those little ridges. What's interesting, Tim, is that there's a lot of nerve endings of the vagus nerve in the roof of our mouth. So it instantly soothes us when we put our tongue there. Children will do this with pacifiers, or if they can't get their tongue to the roof of their mouth because they have a high palate or a tongue tie, then they will use their thumb to act as a spacer. And you will notice in a child that instantly relaxes them. And as soon as you pull that pacifier out, they start crying because their nervous system becomes dysregulated. So the first step with breathing is, where is the positioning of the tongue? And it should be gently placed at the roof of the mouth. When your tongue is in that position, it seals your mouth. So it almost becomes impossible to breathe through your mouth. And it forces you then to breathe through your nose. And your nose is not only designed to smell things and blow things out like snot, but it's also designed to filter and perfect the air that's coming into your body. So I'll spend a moment talking about why we should breathe through our nose, and then we'll talk about the perfect breath at rest. So we breathe through our nose because of a few reasons. One, because we mechanically filter the air. So we have nose hairs and little cilia, which are tiny little hairs that attach to particles before they enter into our lungs. We also pressurize the air. When we pressurize the air, we're slowing down the air that's going into our bodies and pressurizing it so we're able to take a much deeper breath and expand our alveoli, which are at the bottom of our lungs. We actually get 20% more oxygen delivery to our tissues when we slow down our breath. So it sounds kind of paradoxical, but breathing through our nose pressurizes the air, slows down the air, slows down the exhale as well, which increases CO2 slightly, which then increases oxygen delivery to the tissues. We also breathe through our nose to temperature regulate the air. You can have a delta of 100 degrees Fahrenheit from the outside air to the temperature of the air in the bottom of our lungs. So we need to breathe through our nose to, perfect the air as it's coming in. We also use the nose to moisture regulate the air. So if the air is really dry, it's going to moisturize it, but it also recaptures moisture. So people who breathe through their noses generally tend to need less hydration and have better management of their water balance in their body because they're not expelling all this water with every breath that they're taking. So a few reasons why we should breathe through our nose. And another one that's important is that when we breathe through our nose, it increases the production of a very important signaling molecule in our body called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide kills viruses and bacteria and pathogens on contact. And it's also important to note that if I were to ask you, Tim, where does your immune system start? Well, our immune system actually starts in our nose. Our nose is lined with a membrane that produces nitric oxide, assuming we are breathing correctly and we have the right bacteria and the right nutrients in our body. And this will actually kill pathogens, bacteria, and viruses, again, perfecting the air as it goes into our lungs. So back to your original question, once we get our tongue in the right position, we're going to try to just kind of relax our shoulders. We want to be breathing into our belly and then into our chest, and then if we need to, into our throat. But when you're doing what we call a coherence breath, you're barely breathing. So it's paradoxical, but the less we breathe, the longer we live. What we want to do is we want to breathe slow, and we want to breathe about 500 milliliters of air with every breath that we take. And that means about 1/10 to 20% of what our total lung capacity is. So we're not really breathing very much. So the breath in count is for a count of 6, and we breathe out for a count of 6. And for a lot of people, when they start breathing this way, they're like, oh my God, I'm breathing so slow. However, what you'll notice if you're wearing a pulse oximeter, that your oxygen levels are not going to drop. In fact, if anything, they'll actually improve. by slowing down their breath. So that's the way I encourage people to breathe. Like right now, you're sitting there listening to me. That's the way you should be breathing. When you're speaking, that's the breath that I'm going to be using. And so most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, we want people in that coherence breathing because that's going to calm their nervous system. It's going to connect their brain and heart, and it's going to increase oxygenation of the brain, which is obviously one of our most metabolically active tissues. It's going to increase nitric oxide levels. It's going to naturally lower blood pressure as well. And you're just going to be in a much more calm and relaxed state, which is, again, what the world needs more of these days is people in that parasympathetic state where they're able to think more clearly, their creativity and focus is on a different level, and they're much nicer people when they're breathing that way as well.
Absolutely. And we should be exhaling through the nose as well, correct?
Correct. So in through the nose, out through the mouth. I'm sorry, in through the nose, out through the nose. And then there is a time where breathing out through the mouth is appropriate. So I'll just kind of touch on that because you
Yeah.
brought it up. So there's 3 gears to breathing. The first gear is in through the nose, out through the nose. So 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. We might speed up that pace if we're exerting ourselves, or we're running up some stairs or exercising, but we always want to try to come back to that baseline, even between exercise sets. And then the second gear is in through the nose, out through the mouth. So the reason we do that is because we want to get rid of that CO2 that's building up, which is causing the urge for us to breathe. So in through the nose, getting in that nice filtered, perfected air that's pressurized and everything into the lungs. And then we can exhale through our mouth to get rid of the CO2. And then when we're truly like full out sprinting and exerting ourselves, that's when it might be appropriate to breathe in and out through the mouth. And the reason for that is because we're going to rapidly move air in and out, causing a rapid contraction of our diaphragm and an expansion and contraction or inflation and deflation of our lungs, which is going to assist the heart in pumping blood. See, the breath is also a mechanical tool. So our diaphragm and our lungs assist the heart. So if we're running away from something in a fight or flight type of situation, I want to leverage the mechanical aspects of breathing as much as I can. And so that's why breathing in and out through the mouth would be appropriate in a sprinting situation. But then once that situation is over, then we gear down in through the nose, out through the mouth, and then in through the nose, out through the nose. And then we try to slow down and get back to that 6 in, 6 out.
One thing I've seen really popular in the past year, people doing CrossFit, for example, with mouth tape. What are
Mm-hmm.
your thoughts on that? Because one thing you brought up, nasal patency. So a lot of times people are breathing through their mouth because they have sinus congestion, or they might have mold that's colonized the paranasal sinuses. And people will often jump to just taping their mouth. But there was a video going around a few months ago where this guy, he had like clear tape on his mouth, and he just started putting it there. And then during his sleep, he was trying to pull it off because he didn't have nasal patency. And so I sleep with something called nasal mutes, this little piece of silicone that dilates the paranasal sinuses. And so I had sleep apnea. I no longer have it because I have an oral appliance that brings my jaw down and forward. And then I got a laser, photono laser to the posterior tongue muscles. So that prevents my tongue from, sliding down the trachea. And I have a tongue tie that I'm going to get released in a couple of months and do some myofunctional therapy. But all of that is to say that some people, yeah, it's as simple as, okay, you need to focus on consciously breathing through your nose. But other people, we have to take some more delicate steps. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 50% of the population is habitually mouth breathe. And so the nose, just like any part of our body, if we don't use it, we lose it. And so there can be situations where people who are habitual mouth breathers, it's very challenging and difficult for them to breathe through their nose because they haven't used it. And they've examined the noses of people who've had tracheotomies, and this is where you basically breathe through your throat. And what they found is that the sinuses start closing up because the body doesn't like stagnation, right? So we don't want stagnant air in those tissues. So everything starts closing up. But what we've also found, and studies have shown, is that once we start breathing through our nose, that over time things start opening up. So for those people who are, kind of shuddering at the idea of taping their mouth closed because they already have a hard time breathing through their nose, I suggest that you do a taper schedule. So maybe 5 minutes of mouth taping during the day, 10 minutes, 15, 20, work yourself up to a nap. And then you might want to consider trying mouth breathing, or I'm sorry, mouth taping at night. Now, one of the other things that you talked about, it, which is apnea, right? It's a huge deal. Snoring and apnea are very consequential to our metabolic health and very disruptive to our metabolic health, because when we sleep, that's when we heal. And that's when our body should be in its most relaxed state. But if our breathing pattern is such that it's telling our nervous system that we're in fight or flight or in a stress situation, then we don't feel rested when we wake up. We might have high blood sugars or even hypertension, and that could be very disruptive to our healing process. So everyone's anatomy is a little bit different. I have a deviated septum myself, and so one of my nostrils works better than the other. But one thing I learned is that it's not about breathing more, it's actually about breathing less. That's the secret to longevity and better health, is to actually slow down our breathing pattern. And so it's normal for people to feel resistance when they breathe through their nose, because the purpose of the nose is to slow down the air. But then you just have to kind of get used to that. And for some people, it's building up that tolerance to that feeling. And then over time, things start opening up. And of course, some people need surgeries. Some people need, other type of work done. And, if that's the case, then obviously consult with an airway dentist or an ENT that can help identify if that's the case. But everyone's going to be a little bit unique and different. However, I do know, and I think as well, that as we use it, the nose starts to open up over time. And of course, addressing things like air quality, right? Making sure if there's mold in your house, you're getting that addressed. If there's, pollutants or dander or things like that in your air, that you're addressing that as well. That's why we have an air filter in my office, in our living room, in our dining room, and also in our bedrooms as well, because we want to make sure that if we're consuming 30 pounds of air, that it's the cleanest air that it could possibly be.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I have an air doctor running behind me, and because I live in an environment with high humidity, I have a dehumidifier downstairs and upstairs, to prevent mold overgrowth, mold spore development. But going back to what you said, in my experience, so I saw an ENT when I was younger, and I told him, hey, I'm waking up during the night, gasping for air. So he sends me for a sleep study where you go into the hospital, spend the night. And I go to the pulmonologist, and the pulmonologist is like, yeah, you're fine. And I said, well, clearly I'm not fine. I'm waking up. But the airway centric dentists, in my experience, those guys are on it. And like the one who I happen to see locally, she doesn't even do traditional dentistry. They don't do cleanings in her office or anything. It's all airway. And so, if you're listening, I mean, I'm not saying all ENTs are like that. There are certainly really good ones out there. But in general, an airway centric dentist does a great job at evaluating, maxillary width. For example, we don't breastfeed long enough. We don't eat crunchy foods early enough. And that affects the development of the maxilla, the upper jaw. And Sasha and I were talking about the vagus nerve before we started recording. Well, the trigeminal nerve that feeds the face, it feeds into the same nucleus as the vagus nerve. So you can actually have people with anxiety, depression, bipolar, who have misalignment of the TMJ and decreased maxillary width. So I think breathing, it's so important. And like you said, if we're sleeping, we're not going to get deep sleep if our body thinks we're dying. But now I sleep with the nasal mute, but I also sleep at an incline with a wedge, and then my avocado organic pillows on top. And it's been a game changer. So I have to do another sleep study in a couple of months, but I went from 22 hypoxic events per night or per hour to 11.
Nice.
And then hopefully I can get down to around, one or two, because I'm on like the second or third gradation or titration of the appliance. But if you're getting better sleep, then you're going to have more energy to put into things like breath work and movement and eating healthily, etc. So let's talk about how many times per minute should we breathe. I know you said the less we breathe, the longer we live. But realistically, in textbooks, any of our textbooks, you're going to see 12 to 16 breaths per minute. In an ideal functional medicine biohacker world, how many breaths per minute should it be?
Yeah. So if you're following the coherence breathing pattern, that's going to be about 5 breaths per minute.
Awesome. So I had to process
slower
that.
the better.
Yeah, I had to process that because I'm like, man, I need to slow down. Yeah. And so
Yeah.
I have an M wave device from the Heart Math Institute. I need to be more diligent about using it, but the coherence that you're talking about and how our breath, just synchronizes everything. And there's another aspect of breath work, and you'll know more about this than I do, but it's building up your CO2 tolerance. Ray
Mhm.
Peat talks about that. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our tolerance to CO2 is quite fascinating. I mean, not to get morbid, but the more tolerant we are to CO2, the more resilient we are to death. So if we take it, to its extreme, CO2 tolerance is actually very vital to our longevity, but also to our mortality. And so what happens when we increase our CO2 levels in our body, that is what actually creates the urge for us to breathe. So, despite what popular belief is, the urge to breathe isn't because we need more oxygen. In fact, we only absorb about a quarter of the oxygen with each breath that we take. The urge to breathe actually comes from an intolerance to CO2. So, if you want to make yourself more resilient to that feeling of you're dying, then the key is like building up tolerance to CO2. In fact, one of the best tests for mitochondrial function is something called a Bolt test. So a Bolt test is referred to as a blood oxygen level test. And what we do is we simply take a few cleansing breaths in and out. And then on the last relaxed exhale, which means we're not forcing the air out, we're just letting the diaphragm come to its neutral resting position. We plug our nose and we start our stopwatch and we see how long it takes for us to feel that first urge to breathe. Not a breath hold test. It's just paying attention to when that first urge to breathe comes up, and the goal is to get to about 40 to 60 seconds, which sounds easy, but it's not that easy when you first do this test. And so the Bolt test tells us how efficient our body is at its mitochondrial function, but also how tolerant we are to CO2. And then ways to increase CO2 tolerance would be to do, well, the way I'll tell you the way I do it, there's probably many different ways, but when I go for walks, I breathe in for 6 steps and I breathe out for 6+ steps. What I'll also do is I will take a few cleansing breaths and I will plug my nose on a neutral exhale and I will count how many steps I can take and I'll go as long as I can. And that's usually about 25 to 30 steps because that's going to tell my body, although my body's trying to tell me you're dying, I consciously mentally override that because I'm always in control of my breath. And I'll just try to take as many steps as I can because that, again, increases our tolerance to CO2 levels. And so the more we can do things like that, the more tolerant we become to CO2, the less anxiety we experience as well. So a lot of times people who have chronic low-grade anxiety, it's because they have higher CO2 levels because with air and not getting that
Sorry, you
CO2.
froze for like 20 seconds or 15 seconds. Can you repeat what you just said?
Sure. Do you know where I cut off?
Actually, I don't. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
That's okay. So I'll go back to, let's see, 20 seconds. I'm trying to rewind in my head where I started. So the way we increase CO2 tolerance is by putting ourselves in those challenging situations and mentally kind of overriding that feeling. And so you could do that through the Bolt test is a way to test, but you could also extend that Bolt test and just hold your nose a little bit longer and kind of get used to that feeling. But I like to do it when I'm exercising. So I will do an extended exhale when I'm walking or exercising. That helps me become more tolerant to CO2. And then, as I mentioned, what I'll do is I'll take a few relaxed breaths, a relaxed exhale, plug my nose, and try to take as many steps as I can. And I work up to going as many steps as I can without having to breathe in because then I'm building that tolerance to CO2.
Absolutely. I mean, that's fantastic. And it has to be great for metabolic health. You know, sympathetic versus parasympathetic balance. I think people need to understand that all of our healing takes place in a parasympathetic dominant state. And it's never, well, unless you're lifting a car off of a small child, it's never 100% sympathetic or 100% parasympathetic. So our organs, for the listeners and viewers, they have dual innervation. So you have a fight or flight branch, the sympathetic branch, and the rest and digest, feed and breed parasympathetic branch. But most of us don't get enough parasympathetic tone. And what he's describing, Dr. Patel is describing, will increase our parasympathetic tone and facilitate healing, not just because we're getting more oxygen, but because we have a more relaxed healing state of our nervous system, correct?
Absolutely. And one interesting thing about raising our CO2 levels in our system is that it actually increases oxygenation and oxygen delivery to our cells. So it's something called the Bohr effect. And it sounds kind of paradoxical because you would think the less you breathe, the less oxygen is delivered to the tissue. But our body has a really incredible or amazing survival mechanism. And so, the less we breathe, the more CO2 builds up, the more oxygen gets delivered to the tissue. And so in each breath that we take, we actually have like 4 more breaths. And so that's why, we don't die right away. It takes like 4 or 5 minutes because as we stop breathing, CO2 starts to increase, but then oxygen delivery starts to increase at the tissue level as well.
Yeah, I remember in physiology class studying the bends and divers who come up too quickly, but that curve shifts down and to the right with what you're describing, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
So I had John Lawrence, who's both a chiropractor and a naturopath, on the show, and he does. You've probably seen it on social media, but functional cranial release, the technique where he has a device. I don't know what the technical name is, but it has a balloon. It goes up your nose, inflates it as you breathe in, and it works on the dura mater. But he measures people's inspiratory volume, before and then after. And he was the one who fixed Dana White from the UFC his sleep apnea. Do you have any experience with that technique?
I haven't had it done on myself. I've always been curious about it. So I maybe need to find someone locally to help me with that. I've seen people get it done and they report like instantaneous relief. I know it can help with opening up the sinuses and addressing some deviations in the septums as well. So yeah, it doesn't look very comfortable. I don't know how
No.
uncomfortable it is, but
Yeah.
I'm sure it can be very impactful for people. I think it also mobilizes the sphenoid bone as well, if
Yeah.
I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. That. And he said it actually improves eye movement coordination and how the eyes communicate information, sensory information to the brain.
Hmm.
And so, he has people do eye tracking, convergence, looking for convergence efficiency and things like that. And he's seen significant improvements in people's peripheral vision and their ability to track objects. So
So
I think it's
amazing.
all, yeah, it's fascinating. And, at the end of the day, it's not dangerous. So the mechanisms are cool to know, but if it's helping people, why not have it done? That's what I say. Breath work. So we talked about, if you're sitting, there's a certain rhythm of breath or type of breathing you should be doing. If you're jogging, for people who are just getting into breath work, should they start with stationary breathing and then incorporate it into their workouts, or how should they do that?
Yeah, what I like to focus on, Tim, is how people breathe most of the day, because we take about 23,000 breaths a day, right? There's 24 hours in a day, and if people are exercising for an hour, obviously it's important how they breathe. But what I think is the most important thing is how they breathe when they're at rest, because that's how we spend most of our day. And so, 95% of the time we're not exercising and we're either sleeping or at rest or checking email or having conversations with people. So I like to really focus on that. And I actually created a guide. I'm happy to share it with your listeners. And it's called Breathe Like This, Not That. And so our breath should match what we're trying to accomplish. So if you're in an all-out sprint, you want to breathe, full force in and out through your mouth. If you're sitting at your desk, you want to breathe as slow as you can, 6 seconds in, 6 seconds out. If you're trying to go to bed, then you want to lengthen your exhales. So 4 seconds in, 7-second hold, 8-second exhale, and then you breathe in that pattern, because anything that lengthens the exhale is going to get us into a more parasympathetic tone. Another popular breathing technique is box breathing. So if we want someone who's having a panic attack to try to go into a more relaxed parasympathetic state, then yes, let's take a few cleansing breaths. Let's get rid of that CO2 that's accumulated in the lungs. But then maybe we can go to box breathing, which is 4 seconds in, 4-second hold, 4-second exhale, 4-second hold, and then you start with inhaling again for 4 seconds. And just a couple of minutes of that can make a big difference. If somebody wants to increase their energy levels, let's say they don't want to drink coffee in the evening or in the late afternoon, but they need a pick-me-up, then you can do something called bellows breath. And bellows breath is where you, if you've ever been to Tony Robbins, you've seen them doing this, where you're essentially breathing forcefully in and out through the mouth or the nose, whatever's comfortable for you. And you do that for 30 repetitions, pause for 30 seconds, and you do that 2 more times. And it's going to give you a jolt of energy. It's going to raise your adrenaline levels, and it's going to be like having a cup of coffee faster than you could make it. And it's not going to give you those caffeine blues later on and disrupt your sleep. So those are some, some techniques that people can use. And then the technique I shared when I go for a walk, it's called a 6-stepper. So 6 steps inhale, 6+ seconds on the exhale. And that's going to be another breathing technique that people can use. That's really simple and practical. And so that's where I like to start. And then the big thing about breathing is breathing through our nose versus breathing through our mouth, and especially at night. So about 2/3 of people breathe through their mouth while they sleep. And by simply mouth taping, they can also use nasal strips to open up the nasal passages, the mute, inserts that people can use as well, or they can use something called an intake. Those things can be helpful to ensure that they're breathing through their nose. However, just closing your mouth doesn't guarantee that you're not going to snore, right? So the positioning of the tongue makes a difference. The collapsing of the airway makes a difference. The pillow that we use makes a difference. And so we want to strengthen the esophagus by doing certain swallowing exercises or mewing exercises. We want to get our tongue ties snipped if that's the case, because that obviously affects the mobility of the tongue. We want to do things like put nussia oil in our nose, which helps lubricate and purify the sinuses. You can use a navage or a neti pot to help cleanse and rinse the sinuses as well. So, there's so many different things that we can do to optimize how we breathe. And we just listed a handful of them that I think will be helpful for people.
Absolutely. And in terms, your background is in chiropractic. I know when I get adjusted, I immediately feel like I can breathe better. And I know part of that's an increase in parasympathetic tone, but also, if your thoracic mobility is poor, if you're in thoracic flexion, the diaphragm's not going to be able to move properly. The rib cage can't move properly. So talk to people about the importance of getting adjusted.
Yeah, so thoracic mobility and really mobility throughout the spine is crucial because form affects function. And the diaphragm is one of those muscles that doesn't probably get a lot of attention because we can't really see it, but I would argue it's one of the most important muscles in our body. It's also the case for people to have trigger points in their diaphragm. So, a lot of times when I'm starting out and I'm coaching people on breathing, one of the things that I'll have them do is just take a full exhale and just blow the air all the way out, and then kind of hook their fingers underneath their rib cage and see if they can mobilize any trigger points that they might have in their diaphragm. Because those can cause dysfunction in how we breathe as well. So mobility is huge, whether it's getting an adjustment or whether it's doing some stretches like cat camel exercises can be very helpful. I lay on a yoga wheel, so that helps open up my spine and stretches out my rib cage, but also opens up my abdominal muscles. Right, we tend to generally be in a more flex position because of the world we live in. So really, right, anything that's going to help extend us is going to be helpful. And it's also important to note that when we're in that kind of open position, our nervous system is also more relaxed versus being in a flexed fetal position. That creates stress on our nervous system, or in a fight or flight, fearful state.
Absolutely. And so you've been practicing for how long now?
Well, I've been in practice. This will be my 20th year since graduating. And, I found breathing and discovered it through a few different modalities and a few different ways, probably about 4.5 years ago now.
Awesome. What's something that, obviously breathwork, but what are some other things that today you wish you would have known earlier in your career?
Oh man, how much time do we have? I would definitely say there's a few things that I do today that we never learned in school. One is circadian biology. So understanding the impact that the positioning of the sun has on our overall health and wellness, the negative consequences of indoor and artificial lighting on our biology, That's one thing I wish we had learned. Breathing, certainly, I wish we had learned. The importance of sleep, I wish we had learned, and how to improve and optimize sleep. I also wish we had learned about we didn't have wearables back then, but wearables I think should be taught in school, because I think they provide a very powerful intervention and a short feedback loop in order for people to improve their health and wellness. And then I think another big thing is not just what we eat. I think a lot of times we discuss like nutrition, and there's so many different camps when it comes to nutrition. What I like to focus on is how people are eating. So are they choosing the foods that are appropriate for their goals? Are they choosing the right time of day? And are they choosing the right, the right environment to eat in? That's one thing. The second thing is, are they actually chewing their food? Most people don't chew their foods, proudly don't chew their foods, but of course you can't extract nutrition from your food if you don't chew it properly. It's the first step in digestion. Secondly, I want them to chill. I want them to be in a relaxed parasympathetic state, because I want blood flow going to their trunk, to their organs. Next, I want them to cherish that food, right? Really have gratitude for what they're eating, and then check. So, doing a stool test annually, but also daily checking their bowel movements to make sure there's no red flags. And we never learned that in school either. So those are just some of the things that I wish we had learned. And one other thing that I think is important, especially to our listeners today, is learning about the myofascial system, which is a fairly new discovery. It's a whole new organ system that was discovered, I think, in the last 20 years or so. So John Barnes was teaching that, I remember, when I was in school, but we didn't really learn too much about it. And I wish we had learned more about it, because it can be very influential, not only in how we breathe, but also in our emotional health as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thanks for coming on the show. We know you're a busy guy. We're going to put up your links to your website, Living Proof Institute, correct?
Yeah, there's actually, if I may share, there's
Yeah.
certainly we can send people to Living Proof. They can go to becomeproof.com and learn more about our work. And then I also have a whole bunch of free breathing tools and resources that I'm happy to share. And they can go to
Yeah.
breathworkwithsachin.com, and they can get my keynotes, my slides, my James Nestor retreat summary, my Breathe Like This, Not That guide, and any resources that I create in the future. I'll be sharing those in that funnel as well for people to get access to.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And hopefully we can have you back on in the future for some breathwork updates.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend. And thanks for spreading this word. And here's to healthy breathing for everyone listening.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day.